Hello all, and welcome to Sewing Basics. In this video, I will be demonstrating all the very basics of what you need to know before you put a needle through fabric, as well as some tips I've picked up over my years. And for all first-time sewers, keep this in mind. Sewing is a skill. It takes time and patience to learn. Let's get started. Now I'll take you through threading a needle. First, cut the length of thread you want. Unless you're using silicone. We'll talk about that later. Different people will tell you different lengths of thread to sew with, but it's up to you what you're comfortable with. For me, when I'm sewing with one thread, I'll cut a length just past my shoulder. For sewing with two threads, I'll cut a length that's my entire arm span that will get folded in half, as you will see later. Notice how I cut the thread at an angle. For me, this makes it easier to get the thread through the eye of a needle, especially if I'm working with older thread that might fray. Now, this is the hardest part, getting the thread through the eye. The trick is simply patience and steady hands. If your thread starts to fray, you may need to recut the end to keep it smooth. Normally, I would tell you to lick the very end of the thread, but we're trying to keep our hands away from our faces these days. Once your thread is through the eye, it's time to knot it. There are two ways to do this, and one is a bit trickier than the other. Use whichever method works best for you. The first method is wrapping the thread around the needle. Take the end of your thread you want to have the knot on. Pinch the thread and needle very tightly between your thumb and forefinger with the thread behind the needle. I find it helpful to make sure the thread is parallel to the needle here. Then loop that same piece of thread around the end of the needle 3 to 5 times. Now, pinch those loops at the end of the thread together and slip them off the eye end of the needle. Be sure to never let go of that pressure on the loops, or the knot will come undone. Once you reach the end of the thread, the knot is there. If you end up with this little loopy thing, that's fine. So long as you can tug on your thread and the knot doesn't come undone, you're good. The second way of tying a knot is like you're tying a balloon. Wrap the thread around 2 fingers. Pinch the thread between your thumb and closest finger, but be sure there's a tail on the end. Now slip your fingers out and you have a nice loop, but keep the thread pinched. Now, put the tail through the loop and pull the loop closed. It's easier to keep the knot towards the tail if you pinch the wrapped part as you see me demonstrating. Both of these ways of knotting have their merits. The first way I showed you gives you a nice large knot that won't slip through a loosely woven fabric. But it's a little harder to learn right away. The second method is easier to get the hang of, but you may have to make several knots to keep it from slipping through some fabrics. Now, hand sewing with regular plain thread can be annoying. Dry threads like to twist and knot on themselves. But we have a few different ways to prevent this. Historically, people used beeswax to coat the thread and make it smoother. Today, some people still use beeswax, but we also have thread magic, a silicone that makes the thread more slippery. There is also ceramide, a pre-cut waxed thread. I don't have any ceramide in my personal stash, but everywhere I've worked as a seamstress has had some stock of ceramide. There's also a bit of terminology I want to quickly go over. When you're looking at fabric, there's a pretty side and a less pretty side. The pretty side is called the right side. The less pretty side is called the wrong side. The right side should face out. The wrong side should face in. Any ugly stitching or knots should be hidden on the wrong side of the fabric. Lastly, we need to talk about all the tools you'll be using besides thread and needles. Let's start with scissors. There are 3 types of scissors you'll find in a costume shop: craft, fabric, and thread. Thread scissors, or thread snips, will be small like this. They are typically the sharpest scissors in the shop, and they're extremely pointy. Be careful if you pick up a pair of these. Next, we have fabric scissors. These are also extremely sharp, and easily made dull if used on anything except fabric. Good fabric scissors are also expensive to buy and maintain. Absolutely do not use fabric scissors for anything but fabric and thread. Lastly, we have craft scissors. These are your standard, run-of-the-mill scissors we use for everything else. Theoretically, you can cut fabric with these, but you're probably going to ruin your fabric. Use craft scissors to cut anything that's not fabric or thread. The next tool is going to be your best friend, the seam ripper. This one's mine, but I'll insert a picture of a cheap standard seam ripper. When you do this for a living, you want the ergonomic seam rippers. Most come with a cap or a way to hide the blade for safety because this is pointy and will stab you if you're not careful. Note, you won't be ripping with the pointy end, but the blade at the bottom of the U shape. There are a couple of ways to approach seam ripping. You can go from the side, stitch by stitch. If the thread is looser, sometimes you can skip a couple of stitches and still pull the thread through. The second way is to start from the side until you can open the seam, then rip a couple of stitches at a time. Don't do this if you can tell the fabric is older. You can usually feel that the fabric is a little brittle. The fabric is more likely to rip with this method when it's older. I'm going to briefly talk about thimbles. While they're not always necessary, some people find them extremely useful. You can find thimbles made with silicone, metal, or leather. All of them have their merits, but I personally prefer metal. When you're having a hard time getting a needle through particularly thick or tough fabric, it can be used to push the needle through without damaging your fingers. I've pushed a needle so hard that the eye of the needle ended up poking under my skin. While it didn't bleed or hurt too bad, it made a big blister. Don't be afraid to use tools when they might be useful to you. Lastly, let's talk about pins. We use both safety pins and straight pins. Safety pins are kept in a box or stabbed into a pillow for fittings. Straight pins are kept on magnetic pin cushions. Please return them where they belong as you take them out of the fabric. I know for class we're wearing masks, but if you're sewing on your own time, do not put straight pins in your mouth. It's a bad habit I'm trying to fix, but it's a good way to not only stab yourself in the mouth, but also accidentally inhale a pin. Not a fun time. Get a little pin cushion or wrist cushion if you think you'll sew in your own life. That should be everything to get you started. If you have any other questions, comment below or write them down and bring them to class. And until I see you again, happy sewing.